Welcome to Status Dramaticus. Today's episode is the incident report. This show is a total holistic look of just how screwed up nursing has really become. And on today's episode, the incident report, many of you could actually host this show yourself. As nurses, you know how omnipresent violence is in our workplace. So today, Lydia, my co-host, and I are going to talk about our own issues we faced working in the hospital and how many challenges we've seen that come along with dealing with violence on a daily basis and how it affects our coworkers, our patients. It makes our workplace just more toxic and harder to work in. Our workplace is the most violent workplace in America.
That's right, Jason. I think our listeners will remember we've talked on this show before, but 50% of all workplace violence is committed against healthcare workers. And I really have to believe that that number is really underreported. It might surprise a lot of our listeners, but there's no federal law in the United States that specifically says you cannot assault a healthcare worker the way that there are federal laws against assaulting police officers or TSA agents, or even your mailman. Currently, there's a bill that's been in the legislative process for a couple years. It recently passed the House of Representatives last year. Hopefully the Senate will hear it this year. That's HR 1195 for anyone who's interested. But this would be the first federal law that specifically makes it a federal law that you cannot assault a healthcare worker or a social worker, actually. And I think that's so important.
Which is crazy that it needs to be a federal law. I'm pretty sure just assaulting anyone is against the law. But, it seems like this would be a very easy slam dunk for both parties. And why it's taking this long to have something put into law that says, hey, just because your tummy hurts doesn't mean you can punch the nurse and get away with it. It kind of just blows my mind that this hasn't happened beforehand. And really, even if we get this law passed, we really have to, as nurses, demand that we get a protocol and process in place for when an assault occurs.
Right. I think some of our listeners are going to be male, hopefully, obviously. And unfortunately, I think that there's a little bit of a different experience for a male nurse than a female nurse, because I'm sure a lot of my female colleagues know that, patients are going to think twice before they hit a man, but they will not show the same restraint against a woman, especially a woman who's smaller than them. I've been groped. I've been spit on. Obviously, the assaults. Most recently, I was on, almost my second to last shift on a contract. The patient was 6'2", 225 pounds. He punched me in the ribs. I couldn't even go to ER because I knew that they were in code triage ED, which, they're slammed with COVID patients. But I knew that if I went down to ER, I'd be sitting there for 6 hours for a chest x-ray for them to probably tell me what I already knew, was that it's a soft tissue injury. My bruises faded after a little over a week. But what really bothered me the most about this particular assault, and again, I don't know the number of times I've been assaulted before, but this guy was with it. As we've talked about, patients are just behaving worse. And I'm really struggling, and I don't know if there's anybody out there that can relate to this, but I'm really struggling because now I almost feel as if I'm being re-victimized, because if you tell anybody that's not in healthcare about this, they say, well, was that person arrested? Did you call the police? And honestly, none of those things were going through my mind at the time. But now I just feel like, why didn't I call the police? Why didn't I stand up for myself? Why, I should have known that the hospital wouldn't even ask security to come up and have a chat with this guy. I obviously did an incident report, as we're talking about now, as I do on all of my assaults or incidents or with patients or their families. And I obviously charted in his chart, but at the end of the day, there's no repercussions for these people. But again, I think I'm struggling more mentally this time because this guy was with it. And I feel like I should have said, well, I would like security to be called to come up and speak with him. or I should have just gone to the police department after my shift and just filed a report on my own. Because I think if ever nurses were going to get support for this subject, because again, I think the vast majority of the public is always shocked to hear that this goes on so frequently in hospitals. But I just really want to let anybody out there know that if they're struggling with any of these feelings, or if they receive, any kind of pushback from management about speaking up about the violence that's happening to us, I just want you to know you're not alone.
Well, it goes to the point that I said earlier, that there's no protocol in place. A lot of times security is like a police force, so they can file reports. I've seen it happen when something is stolen or anything else. Laws or protocols need to be in place where if you're assaulted, and assaulting isn't just being punched, it's being spit on, it's being scratched. If that happens, automatically that should be triggering of charges are going to be pressed. Security comes in because we still have to take care of our patients. We still have to deal with these people. And plus, we've just been assaulted in our workplace and are still expected to work 8 hours afterwards. To think that we need to stop and then after our shift, after we filled out a 2-hour-long incident report, then go to the police station and press charges after that is ludicrous. This doesn't seem to be very hard. I see security forces all the time taking reports, taking statements, and sending it over to the police. Why it's okay to assault our nurses, our nursing aide, it's beyond me. And that kind of reminds me of something that I just experienced here lately. Patient was coming, going through withdrawals, coming out of the ICU. It was unexpected. He'd punched an aide in the ICU. I get reported, he'd grabbed a nurse by the throat already, threatened to kill her. And I walk on shift and this person isn't in restraints. He was somewhat with it, but it seemed like maybe he had some the Wernicke syndrome going on, so he'd become more confused. And all night long, I had to litigate a case with the providers because they didn't want to oversedate him or whatever to put this man in restraints. And I'm like, he's clearly demonstrated a history of violence towards the staff. Why are we worried about protecting this man's rights and we're not worrying about the staff that has to take care of him? Rule number one, when you learn basic CPR, if the scene isn't safe, don't take care of the people. If your patients aren't safe, if they're going to assault you, why do we have to be forced to take care of them? It's insanity, and it has to stop.
Right. Because the federal law says that no hospital or medical facility can refuse treatment to any patient, whether they have a history of violence against the staff or not. Right. Yet we don't have a federal law that prevents that same person from just coming in and assaulting whoever they want without repercussion. It's a cage match every shift, and there's nothing we can do about it. And there's no consequences for them.
So Lydia, how are you dealing with, this assault, and how are you felt about that? You talked about feeling like you didn't do enough. Did you feel supported by management or by your coworkers after it happened?
That's a really good question. And it actually gives me an opportunity to share some advice I'd like to give to our listeners who might be going through the same situation or have gone through the same situation, or maybe just are anticipating their next assault, because we all know that this is not slowing down. So I did a lot of self-reflection. And again, every time I tried to share my story, because I wanted to talk about it, I wanted to share what was going on. But again, every time that I would say, oh, well, did you call the police? Is that person arrested? Did you press charges? It was no, I didn't do any of those things, because it's never been an option before, or at least never seemed that way. So I thought long and hard about it. And through doing a lot of research, again, finding out that only 35 states even name, assault against healthcare providers specifically in any law, only 35. And again, 0 federal laws against it. Also finding out that nurses, and actually even more violence is committed against nurses' aides than nurses, which is shocking to me because I see how much is committed against nurses. But nurses' aides face roughly 2/3 the same violence rate as police officers, which is crazy. But I think I've just formulated this plan, and this is what I tell myself. And it is, again, so sad that I have to have a plan now for my next assault. But I think the next time at the facility, if they choose to just seeming to want me to just go about my business, I am going to ask that security be called and have a chat with that patient, because that is always within a nurse's rights. And if I get pushback from that, then I will leave the shift and I will go to the police station and I will file a police report, because that is also completely within my rights. And if nothing else, I feel like that's taking back a little bit of my power, in that, there's a record of this, because whether or not after that I choose to press charges, which again is my choice, and it should be my choice. It should be the choice of the person. They should know that they have that choice, because when all that happened to me and every time before, I didn't even know I had that right, to file a police report or to ask security to come speak to the patient. I didn't even know those were options. So for me in the future, that is what I will do. Again, to take back my power. Another sad statistic I've been reading is that the majority of prosecutors, even when charges are filed against patients, they decline to pursue cases against them, or they are settled because they use the excuse of, oh, they weren't in their right mind. They weren't feeling well. They weren't doing this. They weren't doing that. But how come people get to go to a bar and get drunk and they are still held accountable when they are not sober? And that's as they should be, to be clear. They should be held accountable for their actions while they're drunk. But how come they are not held accountable while they're in the hospital? So
Right.
for me, that's how I dealt with it. I've come up with a plan. It's sad that I've even had to come up with this plan, but that's what I'm going to do to take back my power and feel, I guess, not at peace with what's going on, but to feel better prepared for the next time, unfortunately.
Well, feeling powerlessness is one of the worst places to be as a human being. And it was the whole reason why I started the show, working in all these different work environments, not seeing change, seeing things getting worse. The show was, again, the reason we started it was to just take back our power and talk about these issues that we're facing. And, you bring up an interesting thing about people being held accountable out in public by the police, but when they come into the hospital, it's like a no holds cage match. I like to draw this comparison between nurses and police. And many times they end up getting married because they share this like commonality, because we both work with the public. We're working with the same types of people. I mean, many times these cops are picking them up and then dropping them off to the hospital where they continue to behave like assholes, but then suddenly we can't press any charges. If your stomach hurts and you assault a police officer, do you think they refuse to prosecute that person? Do you think that person isn't going to go to jail or going to have excessive force used against them? Absolutely not. But again, as nurses, if someone's tummy hurts, we have to fight to even get restraints, to even protect ourselves in our place of work. And why we think law enforcement, we give them a free hand to do whatever they want when they feel that their lives are being threatened or they're being attacked, is beyond me. They have the power to literally kill someone. Whereas nurses, they tie our hands behind our back when we're having to deal with a violent patient. I don't understand why there's such a difference. But again, statistics show time and time again that we work in the most violent workplace in America, and we are dealing with the same type of people as law enforcement.
Yet we have fewer options for them to have any consequences of abusing us.
So, comparing police officers to nurses, I don't want to give anyone the wrong idea that we're like anti-cop on the show or anything like that. But again, it's a great analogy because we're expecting people without guns and without training, which are the nurses, to basically fight the same people that cops are dealing with that have tasers, guns, handcuffs. It's ludicrous. And to kind of like give you more of like this background and story, like of why we need protocols of when assaults occur in nursing. We've all been trained, like at least we've all got like, those modules where we did a PowerPoint on active shooter training. Lydia has a really crazy story that happened to her while she was working. If you wanted to share that, Lydia.
Yeah, but first, actually, Jason, I think it's important to remember that actually, or maybe not remember, but realize that actually not everybody does get that training. Currently, there are only 9 states that require violence prevention training for healthcare workers, which is crazy to me. But while we're in Michigan, and yes, we've gotten those PowerPoints, and when I was in California, we had to take sexual assault prevention training for the state of California. But actually, there's a lot of states where they don't even get a PowerPoint, let alone any other kind of training on workplace violence. The story I want to share is really my craziest nursing story. And it's also like the closest I've ever seen someone come to having consequences, and the consequences weren't much. But I'll share this. I was on a contract. I was in Detroit. There was no kind of visitor restrictions whatsoever. They had a policy that no one knew what it was or was never kept in place. It wasn't even a patient that got violent. It was a visitor. This person claimed to be the patient's son. The patient was incapacitated in a way where we didn't know if this was true or not. The visitor had some type of mental health issues, and perhaps he just liked staying in that room because perhaps he was homeless and he knew he wouldn't be kicked out, because that's another common thing that you'll see in inner city hospitals if they don't enforce visitor restrictions. This hospital was so old, it didn't have metal detectors, nor did they install them on ER. Anyway, one night I was on a stretch of 4, and this visitor got pretty agitated with me. And I went to the charge nurse, received no support, which I'm sure is not a surprise to many.
Pretty typical.
Yeah, pretty typical, right? He said but I did find a coworker to switch her assignment with me. So we switched, and then that visitor ended up flipping out on her. And they had actually, the day shift had asked that visitor to finally leave. He'd been in that room for about 2 weeks, and called the day shift nurse a stupid bitch. And so they encouraged him to go home and take a break. So he wasn't back that night. I came back a third night and walk into the shift, and I can hear screaming. And it's this visitor screaming in the face of the patient and telling, man, you need to fucking calm down, man. But again, this patient was incapacitated. So I'm not sure who the visitor thought that they were talking to. But the charge nurse that night was really great. I'll never forget her. So shout out to Charisse in Detroit. But super experienced. She's seen it all, done it all. And thank God for her, because she went in there like without a pause, and said, hey, man, you need to go for a walk. Like, wrap your head around yourself or something. Get yourself under control. Well, that was this guy's cue, because he starts screaming about this fucking place, these fucking bitches. You fucked with the wrong one, blah, 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 blah. And I'm thinking, what the hell? Like, these behaviors have been just continuously escalating for 2 weeks. I get on the phone with security. I said, hey, this guy's walking through the hall, screaming his head off. You need to come get him. And I give him a description. I think that's the end of it, right? But nope, about a half hour later, I'm in my other patient's room, which was kind of kitty corner. The unit is kind of like a horseshoe. So I could hear that patient talking on his cell phone. I'm not sure who he was talking to, but making clear and obvious threats, talking about these bitches fucked with the wrong one, and he's not one to be fucked with, and he's about to show these bitches who the fuck he is and make them sorry. Again, obvious and clear threats. I go back to Charisse, and she says, I'll handle it. And I knew she would. So I happened to be in my other patient's room shortly later, which was on the other side. There was that one room in between my 2 patients. And I'm removing an A-line. And as we all know, you have to hold pressure on an A-line to make sure the bleeding has stopped. And just as I do it, I see there's a glass wall behind me, then it's me, and then the patient's bed. This patient was neurologically intact, but physically paralyzed. Anyways, I see 4 security officers walking past the door, which I kind of kick shut with my foot as I'm now beginning to hold pressure on his wrist. And I start to hear screaming, and then I hear thuds, and then I hear bangs, and I'm hearing, you can't fucking touch me. You can't fucking touch me. Don't fucking touch me, man. And the patient, I'll never forget what he said, but he looks at me, and again, I'm staring at the clock, like pretending I don't know what's going on. And he looks at the curtains drawn at the glass wall behind us, and then looks back at me, and I'll never forget how he broke that silence. But he said, you know, I've had a few run-ins with the law myself, and someone should tell that guy that as soon as you tell him not to touch you, that's their cue to start touching you. And I said, that's great advice, sir. Somebody should have told him that. This is getting progressively scarier. And again, it's all happening in a matter of moments, but it seemed like forever, because I'm not sure if this man has a gun. I'm pretty sure he doesn't, because I haven't heard gunshots, but he perhaps could have a knife. I'm still hearing screams. I'm hearing, move that out of the way, move that out of the way. Like, you know, there's no metal detectors on the door. I know that. So, I have no idea what kind of weapon he could have or what's going on outside. But at this time, as I'm thinking these things, and again, can't remove my hands from this patient at the time, one of the staff nurses comes in and she's crying and she says, what do we do? What do we do? And this is several years ago, before active shooter training was as frequent. And I looked at her and I said, don't you have a policy for this? You work here. Like, what do you do? And she's just crying hysterically. And, I'm just thinking, what do we do in this situation? So I told her to get on the floor. I told her to turn the lights off. I told her to push this one chair against the door. There's nothing I can do, because again, I'm standing with my back to a glass wall. Luckily the blinds are pulled, but I said, get out your cell phone and call 911. She goes, aren't they the police? I said, you know what? It doesn't sound like a little more backup could hurt right now. Long story short, I was able to, stop holding pressure on the man's arm, and we ended up seeing them drag this patient out hogtied. And as he's leaving, he's yelling, I'm coming back for you bitches. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, you probably will, sir. We'll see you tomorrow. But, the craziest thing out of all that was the security sergeant had to come up later for patient labels for the report. And I said, so he's arrested, right? Like he's in jail now. And the sergeant looks at me and goes, what are you talking about? I said, well, you heard the threats, like everything that happened, he's not arrested. And he goes, no, we can't arrest these people. We put them in a holding cell downstairs until they calm down. And then we have to let them go. And I think that is so crazy to me, that this man, wherever he is still walking around out there. No, nothing on his record, nothing that prevents him from doing anything like that again. And, that's why I go back to, like, even just me filing a police report to take back my power in the future, that would be on his legal record. So if he does do something in the future, God forbid, assault someone on the street or, something worse, they could look back and have that file, and it will be held, in the future,
It'll hold them accountable,
right.
because
And that makes me feel better at the end of the day.
this wasn't the first time this guy behaved this way. For you to act that way in a public facility to where you have to get hogtied, oh, that isn't your first rodeo, son. Like, you've been doing this for a minute, okay? Right?
This is Tuesday.
Right, exactly. And like, first of all, I want to applaud you, Lydia, because I probably would have wrapped that A-line up and like hit the floor. So you're a way better nurse than I am. Like, I don't know if I would have been standing there with shots fired. Like, bravo to you. But I mean, it's mind blowing that this man again and again is causing trouble in our places of work, and we let them come see their loved ones over and over. Like, when are we going to take the stance that just because your loved one is sick in the hospital doesn't mean you get unfettered access to them and you get like the ability to act like an asshole? To see your loved one in the hospital and be with them as they pass away, that is a privilege and not a right. And we need to start taking that stance. Like, if you come in, regardless of like if your loved one is passing, if you act like a jerk or a complete asshole or threaten staff or like, create an active shooter situation, you don't get to come back. I'm sorry. You screwed over your loved one who may have to like pass away without having their family there. It is not a right. It's a privilege. But all too often, these like health, corporate healthcare systems are more and more worried about their image and like what it will do to the revenue if it gets out that, oh, this hospital wouldn't let me see my loved one while they were dying. Well, the backstory is that you were punching nurses or you were threatening to kill people, you know. So when are these places going to start taking the sides of the staff? You know, and corporate healthcare is just shitting the bed. And COVID and everything else has really removed that veil and that mask that says, hey, nurses, hey, support staff, we don't give a shit about you. We really don't. You know, you're there to like put in numbers in a computer that generates revenue from us. And guess what? If they can continue to generate the same amount of revenue that they are now with the same staffing numbers, we're never going to get back that staff that we had before. Like, that's a pipe dream. You know, and just to kind of bring home this idea of how terrible like the administration responses are and like what corporate healthcare is, I want to share a couple stories that I've experienced. And it was made clear to me that these power structures, you know, we talk about working in environments where they're non-punitive, where if a mistake happens, oh, let's debrief, it's no one's fault, you know, let's see why this happened so we can prevent it from happening again, like what some places call a near miss. But honestly, if it's a certain type of mistake or it may like involve family that it could become litigious, more often than not, the corporate healthcare structure will protect themselves and paint that nurse that is involved, because we don't generate revenue for them. They will paint them as a bad nurse and they will get rid of them. Just to highlight this, I wanted to share with you guys a story. I was working, I think it was the second wave, the second surge, and I was at Michigan Hospital. And I want to say this is like my second month in, and I'm working day shift, and I kid you not, I'm averaging like 25 to 28,000 steps a shift working in this place. I mean, I'm working myself to the bone because this hospital, even though we're in the second wave of COVID, it was like their first wave for them because of the stay-at-home orders. They didn't experience any COVID patients. So they were still like doing things like nurses draw all the blood, nurses pass all the lunch trays. They were trying to limit the amount of people going into the COVID rooms. So AKA nurses did everything. So, you know, they thought it was okay to like have us with 5 or 6 patients, you know, and since I was like the step down nurse, all these like med surgeons nurses were like, oh, you can have the BiPAP patients. So usually 4 or 5 of my 6 would be on BiPAPs, and they'd be on tele and they'd be constantly desatting. So it was insane. And I was contracted 48 to 60 hours a week there. So, I mean, I was like hoofing it. So I want to say it was like maybe my second month going into my third month, I get pulled to a different floor. I have 5 patients this day. It's towards the end of the shift. And this, you know, healthcare system, suddenly I start seeing like administration types on the floor, and then there's news cameras. And this health system came up with the great idea that they're going to be the first healthcare system in the country to allow families at the bedside of people who have terminal COVID. So they dress the families up in the Pampers and the spacesuits, and you know they got the cameras there just to show like how like innovative they are, irregardless of like, okay, you're letting families come see these people instead of using iPads, but you won't let ancillary staff draw blood or people pass lunch trays. And you're making the nurse do all that. And now you're adding to the nurse's burden by having family at the bedside. So this patient I was caring for was, you know, deteriorating. ICUs were full. And, you know, if you're not getting intubated at this point, you're not going to the ICU. They made him a DNR, which was great. It was great for that patient, you know, family, doctors, we all talked. But it came down to me that, okay, we want to do a terminal wean because he's maxed out on BiPAP. You know, he's got nowhere to go. And usually, like, you know, terminal weans are reserved for if someone's being weaned from being intubated. And they're usually done in the ICU, which, Lydia, you told me this. They're usually 1-to-1, right?
Yeah, terminal wean from a ventilator at most facilities is 1-to-1. So it's super inappropriate that you would have, you know, 5 or 6 other patients if you're doing terminal wean from BiPAP. It's a little bit different, but again, that person should still be comfortable. Right. And I guarantee, like, actually, some people might not know this, but Jason, we were on that same contract together. We were both in that hospital. That particular facility has no policy in place for terminal weans, which is crazy to me because most facilities do.
Right. So this is my first terminal wean. And I'm always of a nurse that's like, I'm a traveler, I'm here to help. Okay, I'll make it happen. I've done comfort care a million and one times. Like I've done this, I've helped people pass, but it didn't like click to me like with the terminal wean as in like how much medication and what I really needed to push for from my providers to get. So long story short, after going back and forth, this patient had gotten like was on a morphine drip for a grand total of like 2 hours or so, maybe got a total of like 3 or 4 milligrams of morphine, a couple extra pushes from me. And then literally the manager goes, well, let's get this show on the road. The family's batteries are running out. So if you're okay, let's go ahead and get this going. And I'm like, okay. You know, I had assessed them and he's not really responding to me. And at that point, you know, not
Was he
having
still on
done
the
it
BiPAP at this time?
he's still on the BiPAP, you know, not responding. So I'm like, okay, I think he looks sedated enough. Let me take this BiPAP off. I talked respiratory. I'm like, what's your protocol? Remove the BiPAP, put him on the nasal cannula. And I'm like, I feel like I should turn the BiPAP down slowly, but okay, it's your protocol. I'm exhausted. It's getting close to the end of my shift. And I want to make sure this happens in front of the family. Well, that was my mistake. As soon as I go in the room, my manager literally takes off. The doctor who's ordering, like, who's a med surg doctor who doesn't know like ICU protocols. Oh, and he was like helping out. He was from the West Side too. He wasn't even part of that facility, so really didn't know anything. Poof, gone. Like dematerialized into the atmosphere. I don't even know where they went. It was like Harry Houdini shit. It was like I don't even know how you disappear that fast, but they're gone. And so I take the BiPAP off, and sure as shit, the man starts just guppy breathing like a freaking fish out of water.
That's
The
how it
family
goes.
sees this. They literally start bawling and praying to God in front of me, please, God, take away my father's pain.
Oh my
Please.
God.
I'm like, holy shit. I have a morphine drip and I have no pushes. What the fuck do I do? So, you know, I saw this as an emergency. I want my patient to pass away without pain, in dignity, in front of their family. So I bolus my patient. I give him 3 boluses, probably a total of 30 milligrams of morphine to like treat his respiratory distress. And sure as shit, wow, it works. The man passes away in peace. Like standard algorithm for treating respiratory distress for patients that are on comfort care.
Yeah, so it's important to note here that this, like I said before, this facility doesn't have a specific policy, which is crazy. And then also, even if they did, you were a travel nurse there, so you can't be oriented to every single policy that a facility has. So it's super inappropriate to assign a patient to you that you're not familiar with, and then also you were just left without any kind of guidance, no doctor support, no management support.
Right. So,
Just put it in
you
an
know,
impossible
just
situation. And
like witnessing this like traumatic event, I'm like numb walking out of here. I see the assistant manager and I'm like, that shit in there can't ever fucking happen again. That's what I said to her verbatim. And apparently, like that may have like sent the wrong message to some people. Well, guess I didn't realize that at the time because I'm like in a fog watching this man almost guppy, like gasping for air in front of his like 3 or 4 family members, you know. So I'm a little dazed. I do some basic charting and I get the fuck out of there. I come back in Monday and like halfway through my shift, I get called in the office. And I'm like, oh, good. Maybe we're going to get to talk about like what happened because I charted the discrepancy of morphine because, oh, for your listeners, I didn't have the PRN like order for morphine. So, you know, I was treating it in an emergency, but there was the discrepancy. So I get called in thinking we're going to like debrief about the situation. And then suddenly like the director's sitting there, the manager's sitting there. And I start getting grilled about like, oh, well, you gave this much morphine and there should have been this much left. And I get this like weird feeling that suddenly like I'd done something wrong instead of talking about like how we could have had the right orders in place for that situation. I start feeling like I'm kind of on trial here. And I've been in this situation once before, and I'm like, okay, I don't like the way this was going. So I basically tell them, like, look, it was a judgment call. The man was in respiratory distress. If you need to fire me, I understand, but I would do it again because that was my patient. He's on comfort care, and he's struggling to breathe in front of his family. The director, in her all-knowing wisdom, goes, literally, it was almost like a nursing textbook. Why didn't you put the BiPAP back on and then go outside the room and call the doctor? I was like shocked. Like my mouth fell open. My mouth fell open. Like, and I was like, do you want me to like explain to you like the S curve that goes with oxygenation and how you can't just instantly recover people, or like that it was an isolation room, or the doctor had left the building and I would have been talking to a different shift completely. Like this was an emergency situation. I've explained myself here. And then when I said that I was going to quit, I think it also like tripped these like red flags of like possible, like I might sue them or something. So they're like, well, there's going to be an investigation. We're going to have to take you off the floor. And so I gave a report and I left, and I was like, I really don't like the way this is going to go. So I just had this weird feeling that maybe they're going to paint me as like I stole these drugs. So literally, I drive home. Before like I get it home, my 2-hour drive, I get fired from the facility, from the staffing agency. I'm done, terminated, whatever. They don't want me back. So the next day I take my own drug test. Well, lo and behold, you know, as it unravels, they report me for this to the state for and accuse me of diverting drugs from my patient because of the morphine discrepancy. And as I got a lawyer and lawyered up, we got like the emails back and forth. One of the emails literally said they didn't want to like talk to the family that was in the room because they were afraid of blowback. Well, if you're actually doing an investigation, don't you think you want to talk to the 4 witnesses that were at the bedside that would have saw me diverting the medications I would have been giving to their father? Those seem like pretty good eyewitnesses if you're going to do an investigation and not just throw the nurse under the bus because if you're afraid of an incident. In like corporate medicine is so fucked up in their thinking, they don't realize I saved them from the blowback by my actions. Long story short, you know, I'm going through currently the whole nursing board process. You know, I had to get reported to the healthcare providers, you know, drug problem people, where that was fun. Because since the hospital said I diverted stuff, if I didn't start going to their program and then get evaluated by a psychiatrist and do monthly drug tests, I automatically forfeit my license, even though every single drug test and hair test I had was clean. Now I've talked to the investigator. I'm waiting for the Board of Nursing's judgment, and most likely I will still get a sanction on my license for treating this patient. So this is how toxic these environments have become. I am on a COVID surge contract, helping the community, doing things that are outside my scope because we are in crisis, we are in surge, and they find the time to report me to the nursing board for helping my patient to pass away in peace. It's mind-blowing.
I think another good point about that, and again, I've heard this story before, we've talked about it before, is that they were actually kind of on the downswing of COVID at that time. And I think that they had, and I've told you this before, I think they had more travel nurses than they needed, so that they were using excuses to get rid of anyone to save money. Because again, we all know that at the end of the day, it's only about money for corporate medicine. And I actually know, and I've told you this before, but I'm telling our listeners now, I heard that they got rid of several other travel nurses on trumped up charges just to save their money. And I think there's probably other travel nurses out there listening that can relate when something that was made up about them, or places looked for any excuse to get rid of a traveler when it's clear that their budget isn't fitting it, or they don't have the needs, or they don't have the census anymore to justify having this traveler, but perhaps the traveler is working with a great agency that has strong contracts that require that traveler would still be paid their 2 weeks if they had to cancel due to low census. So I think that's another thing to bear in mind, is that maybe they were just looking for any excuse to get rid of anybody at that time. And that's why I ended up not renewing there.
Absolutely. It was such a toxic environment. And like, it's not just at this one health system. I've experienced it before, like when I first started doing like a flex position, which is kind of like in-house traveling for a health system, where I had said the wrong thing. And it got back to, you know, the upper management. And I was talking to my manager, and they literally asked me, it was overheard that you said the best part of that you like about being a flex nurse is that you don't have a manager. And I was like, I'm a new nurse, so I was like, yeah, it is pretty great. Like, I didn't know I couldn't like say this. Like, am I doing something wrong? And before I knew it, like suddenly there was being reports that had come out, red forms that I'd never heard of, that I gave an antibiotic late. And then they had talked to HR, and then HR had like determined that they should report me to the board of nursing for giving antibiotics late. And being a new nurse, I was just like, what? What are you kidding? And so I just resigned from there, luckily. So I think literally the key word, like if you are in this situation, don't say you're going to quit, just resign. And that like will stop hospitals from like taking these trumped up charges and then having to push them to the board of nursing. So you can sidestep some investigation there, I believe, in most cases. But you know, this hasn't just happened to me. You had another issue at a different place with management as well, right, Lydia?
Yeah, we're talking about incident report, but sometimes, and we've all been threatened by patients and their families, but sometimes the threats come from management, right? Just as in, both of your scenarios. I was on a contract and I had not even clocked in yet. And I got to the floor early to find out my assignment. I'm an ICU nurse, and I had specifically had negotiated in my contract that I would not float anywhere but ICU. They could float me to the sister hospital's ICU, but I would not be floating to other ICU. I'm sorry, I would not be floating to other units outside of any ICUs. I get my assignment. They say I'm floating to another unit. I'm sorry. I said, I'm sorry, that's not another ICU. And they said, well, no. And I said, well, what are my options here? They're like, I said, I have it right here in my contract. And of course I pulled it up on my email, because any traveler should keep their contract right on their phone with them at all times if they have those things in their contract. But this was a Sunday night, and I talked to the manager of the travel nurses, who was also the float pool manager. And I said, so what are my options here? Like, I'm not comfortable floating to this unit. I've never been oriented there. My contract specifically says, and she goes, that's not the contract that we negotiated with your agency. And I said, well, I didn't sign that contract. I signed the contract that I have here that, she was refusing to want it to be emailed to her or anything. I said, can I just take a voluntary cancel and I'll just go home for the evening if you don't have any ICU needs? She said, I'm going to have to count that as abandonment. I said, I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. Not only have I not clocked in, I have not accepted report on any patients. So I'm not responsible for any patients. So I don't agree that it would be abandonment. She goes, how is it not? I have no one to replace you. But, what she doesn't realize is that's not abandonment. That's her being short-staffed. Because I'm a team player, I agreed to float that night, and I explained to her, I said, but I will, need to be talking to my agency in the morning about my contract. And there's just so many more ways that she could have handled that situation, or worded it and said, I'm so sorry, it's a Sunday night. I'm so sorry that there was confusion. Can you just do this for us tonight, and we will sort it out with your agency first thing in the morning? And I would have been totally cool about it. But the fact that they think that they can resort to threats immediately, false threats is insane. But this is another situation where I was not going to be keeping quiet about what happened to me. So I actually sent an email to my agency stating that I felt that my contract had been broken by the facility, and therefore I would not be completing it. And I actually got some great feedback from some travel nurses I'd made friends with that were still there, because they now will no longer give ICU nurses floated to other units more than 4 patients, because where I was floated, I was threatened with having to take 6 patients, even though I have never taken 6 patients in my entire career. And shout out to all the nurses that can and do that in a hospital, because I don't know how you do it. I spoke up early on in shift and made it very clear, despite a lot of flashback. And thank God the charge nurse was very kind that night and understanding. And I think she'd been put in that position, fairly recently, of being a charge nurse. So she still was very kind and understanding. But yeah, so I actually got some really good feedback. My agency stood by me. They actually forwarded up the chain to the manager of that account with that hospital system. And I've learned that now they don't give travel nurses more than 4 patients when floated out of the ICU. So it's amazing. Always important to find your voice and speak up whenever you can.
Yeah. And, sticking up for you, Lydia, and repping my med surg and ICU homies, literally, like many ICU nurses their brains don't work and they don't literally comprehend on how to take care of 6 patients. Like it's just like it doesn't work. It's like when you've been doing something for so long and you have a routine and then you ask someone to step outside of that routine and like triple their workload suddenly, and they're used to being and working in such a thorough fashion, it becomes a very dangerous proposition when you do that to an ICU nurse. And I kind of want to wrap up here with, I just had a phone call last week where another nurse was asking me what they should do because management had overheard that they may call in, and that manager literally called their agency and said if this nurse calls in, they will be blackballed from the system and fired. Like, okay, first of all, I understand management, you're well within your right to terminate someone if they're not meeting the contract, but to say you're blackballing someone from an entire system, it's like this idea of these threats and these like heavy anvils that these managers turn to, and it's like acceptable in corporate healthcare. And before COVID, what I don't think a lot of us nurses have realized is that this idea of violence in our workplace and the lack of response by our workplace has been showing us that corporate medicine does not give a shit about us. COVID has finally opened our eyes to that, and we are in crisis. So when a system is in crisis, that is the time to act. So what do we do with this information, and what do we need to change? Now as nurses, we are dealing with the fourth wave of COVID. The system is in a slow collapse. We really need to take this opportunity to make it the healthcare system that we want it to be, and realize the power that you have as nurses in this moment and time due to COVID, due to the crisis this healthcare system is experiences, and act. So let's start normalizing talking about violence in the workplace. If someone gets punched or hit, ask them if they're okay. Ask them to go see someone. Make sure they're filing an incident report. Demand that charges are pressed. Let's stop normalizing violence in the workplace, and let's stop normalizing like corporate medicine not giving a shit about us as nurses. We got into nursing for service, not servitude. Well, thanks again for listening to us on the incident report. As you can see, many of you could have hosted this episode yourself. And again, Lydia, thanks so much for sharing your stories with us.
No, I hope that, anyone listening out there knows and realizes you are not alone. You are far from alone. And again, the more we speak out, the more comfort and change we can bring about for each other.
That's right, Lydia. And as this show progresses, our goal here is to really start to create a place where nurses can be heard, where we can start to think about how we can take collective action to bring about change in our workplace and to bring about a new healthcare system that not only benefits us, but benefits our communities and benefits our patients. Thanks again for listening to us. This has been another episode by Status Dramaticus.
Jason, I want to get your opinion. As a male nurse, do you think that patients respond to you differently? Do you think that they're more hesitant to abuse you?
Great question, Lydia. Absolutely, they respond to me differently. I'm like a 275-pound guy, so I'm a bigger guy, but just being male, you get a different reaction from patients, especially usually if a patient's like quote unquote been a problem patient all night and I walk in there. I generally don't have many problems with them off the bat. I also think that there's kind of this idea as we take care of our older patients, something I've been working over my head, where women for a long time in this country have been treated very poorly by men in this country. And, you see these older men that will just talk to their nurses like they're their wives and treat them as servants, treat them as sex objects, but they give respect to a male nurse more readily. Many times they think I'm the doctor, like that's something important. And I'm like, no, bro, I'm your nurse. So I actually work for a living. So I do think there's a huge, huge difference. And, I always tell my female coworkers, Like if a patient gets violent, find me, find like a team to go in there and don't deal with it one-on-one. And also, picking up heavy things, a lot of times they come and find me to do that as well, but that's okay. Putting in female Foleys, I always get my female coworkers to do that because many times I'll just end up trying to catheterize the clitoris. That's a true story.
Yeah, I just had a rough day on Twitter today because and one of the reasons I got off Facebook, I'm glad I got off Facebook before I was doing those interviews because I had to look up the Donlin report on YouTube because I needed the YouTube link. And I made the mistake of looking at the fucking comments and they're just saying, oh, I gotta send you this fucking screenshot because I don't know why this one bothered me the worst, but it said that this is my brother's room and that I live in the basement and that I come up to my brother's room because the Wi-Fi is better. Or I'll send you this fucking screenshot. And I'm thinking to myself, why? I'm sorry that you live in such a cave that females can't like basketball or whatever.
We're just, we're going to get trolled by shitbags. Like, I'm sorry that this is just occurring to you now, but you're a little late, Lydia.
That I'm not alone in it. That's really cool.
You should mount that, like take a, and put it on your wall, to be honest. Make it a thing of power out, like, because it's a funny comment. It's like, you know what, if you can look at it and it stops bothering you, then it turns into a thing of power where it's like, fuck you, don't give a shit.
Like, hey, she thinks this room is so dope, it could be a man's room.
Yeah. Right, just put it right on the wall there, you frame it, the screenshot. Thanks again for listening to us. This has been another episode by Status Dramaticus. Thanks again for listening to us. This has been another episode by Status Dramaticus.